It's 12:30 in the morning. A warehouse in Ontario, California. 1.2 million square feet of toilet paper, diapers, and paper towels. 20 people are working the night shift, and one of them is filming himself on his phone. He walks through the aisles, lighting pallets on fire as he goes. And in the video, you can hear him say the same thing over and over. All you had to do was pay us enough to live. Within minutes, the building is gone. Not damaged, gone. And it takes 175 firefighters and 6 alarms to try to fight a fire that they eventually can't even fight from the inside. The roof collapses, and 8 hours later, it is a total loss. The damage lands somewhere between $500 million and $600 million. The man in the video, Shamel Abdulkarim, is 29 years old. He does not even technically work for Kimberly-Clark, whose products filled the warehouse. He works for a third-party logistics contractor called NFI Industries, which operated the building on Kimberly-Clark's behalf. He was arrested 2 miles from the scene, and he really confessed before the officers could even finish asking all their questions. And then his video spreads. Millions of views. And the comment sections are not universally applauding him. They don't cheer necessarily, but they also really don't condemn him either. And a lot of people say some version of, well, I would never do that. I get it. And I really felt that line, right? That reaction, the complicated mix of horror and the recognition of all the problems in the workplace, that's what I want to talk about today. Because the Kimberly-Clark fire, it's not an isolated act of workplace rage. It is probably the loudest and most bombastic that we've seen, but it's a pattern that's been building for years and is accelerating in ways that a lot of people in positions of corporate power are either not seeing or actively choosing not to look at. And here's the thing, we have seen this before, not fire specifically, but the conditions that lead to fires. And the history is instructive if anyone's willing to take a look at it. Before we get into the events, we need to look at the economic ground that these events are happening on, because the anger is not just coming from nowhere. Jerome Powell, the chair of the Federal Reserve, said recently that the United States is seeing net zero private sector job growth. Net zero. That's a striking statement from someone who's not known for dramatic language. Oracle laid off 30,000 workers. Meta is in the process of cutting around 15,000 plus more. And those numbers are just the headline announcements. They're not capturing the full picture. So people who stopped getting callbacks, who just sort of gave up, who aged out of hiring consideration, who went into forced early retirement and stopped being counted in these unemployment figures. The official rate does not include people who've just stopped looking. It does not include people who took a part-time job because nothing full-time materialized for them. So the real picture of labor market distress is considerably wider than the number that you will hear on the news. And here's where it gets psychologically specific. According to Gallup's 2026 State of the Global Workplace report, only 28% of U.S. workers said in the fourth quarter of 2025 that it was a good time to find a quality job. And in the second quarter of 2022, that number was 70%. That is a huge collapse of worker confidence over 3 years. And Gallup is calling what's happening right now the Great Detachment, always some sort of name. These workers are stuck in jobs that they don't want. So they keep applying elsewhere and they keep not hearing back, ghost jobs and the like. And so they're staying put, but they're checking out. And 52% of workers are not engaged and 17% are actively disengaged. Gallup's chief workplace scientist put it plainly. So when people feel like they have no choice, psychological turnover goes up even if physical turnover does not. So people stop bringing their whole selves to work. And you know what that produces is a workforce that is physically present, but spiritually somewhere else, waiting and watching, some of them actually getting angrier and angrier by the month. And here's a number that should concern every CEO who's reading the Boston Consulting Group's research right now. Only 37% of CEOs say that they are worried about rising employee disgruntlement, which means 63% are either not worried or simply not paying attention. That gap between what's happening in the building and what leadership thinks is happening in the building is historically dangerous. Let's put the Kimberly-Clark fire in context because, again, this is not something that just happens in isolation, right? A few days before that, an Amazon warehouse worker in Oregon died on the floor while his coworkers were told to keep sorting packages. That story came out the same week. And then in December of 2024, a CEO of a major health insurance company was shot and killed in New York. The reaction online was, again, not universal horror. It was complicated. The reaction online was, again, not universal horror. It was very complicated. So some people were absolutely horrified and upset, and other people made memes. And a significant number of people said, either quietly or loudly, that they understood the anger even if they rejected the act. Abdul Karim explicitly compared himself to that moment in text messages to friends. So he thought he was speaking on behalf of the American people. That is framing that you need to understand. It tells you something about how a certain segment of the workforce is interpreting their own circumstances. And they're not thinking of it as personal failure or bad luck. They're looking at it as a systemic injustice that they think someone should do something about. If this video is hitting the mark for you, hit that subscribe button and share this with someone who needs to see it. All right, here's where we're going to go back in time. History might not repeat itself exactly, but it's going to rhyme, and this particular rhyme is loud. So in 1909, garment workers in New York went on strike. The people who were on strike were mostly women, mostly immigrants, and they worked in factories where the doors were literally locked to prevent breaks and thefts. The work conditions were insanely unsafe. The pay was a poverty wage. They wanted a union, and the owners refused to settle with them. 16 months later, on March 25, 1911, fire broke out at the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory. The doors were locked. The workers couldn't get out. 146 people died, and most of them were young women. Some of them jumped out of the building. The public outrage that followed didn't just dissipate over time. It created organization. It turned into political pressure, new labor laws, and eventually the framework of worker protections that defined the 20th century. Now, what's important to understand is that the Triangle Fire did not come out of nowhere either. It came out of the end of years of ignored complaints, blocked unions, and a class of factory owners who believed that the arrangement that they had with their workers was acceptable because it was profitable. Now consider the parallels to today. Workers are locked out of job mobility in a labor market that's just not hiring. Their real wages have not kept pace with the actual cost of living. The people at the top of these companies they work for are accumulating historic levels of wealth. And the official response when asked about the employee disgruntlement is that only a third of CEOs think it's even worth thinking about. The Triangle Fire was that moment when the pressure became impossible for these CEOs and owners to ignore. And the question today is not whether today's tensions will produce their own flashpoint, but what will actually happen afterwards. Union protections in this country are federally guaranteed under the National Labor Relations Act. Workers have the legal right to organize, to strike, and to act collectively. Those rights are not often well understood by the workers who hold them, which is in and of itself part of the problem. But there's a newer wrinkle that's worth watching. So much of today's labor anger doesn't actually land on corporations directly. It lands on the contractors. So Abdul Karim did not work for Kimberly-Clark. He worked for NFI Industries. And the Amazon worker who died in Oregon didn't die working for Amazon precisely. He was in a building that Amazon operated through a complex set of subcontracts. There's a shell company logic at work in how corporations distance themselves from the conditions of their own supply chains. The anger reaches the workers first, and then the liability is designed to stop several layers before it reaches the company whose name is actually on the product. Here's another story to show you how this works. So, a Disney Springs restaurant worker named Julia Ruiz was allegedly fired in part for union organizing. The restaurant, Pizza Ponte, is not owned by Disney. It's owned by the Patina Restaurant Group, which is a third party subcontracted through Disney. Disney's own unionized workers came out in solidarity, with one of them saying plainly, "I have the protection of a union contract, and Julie does not, and that's not right." And that's the modern labor landscape. The anger's real, the accountability is deliberately diffuse. There is a consequence of mass unemployment and workforce detachment that tends to get left out of the economic analysis. And frankly, I think it's one of the most important parts of this conversation and the part you're least likely to hear anywhere else. Job loss is not just a financial event. Research is clear on this. This is a very deeply psychological event. Studies of factory closures where everybody in the community loses their job at the same time shows that nearly all of those workers experience significant mental health decline afterwards. The damage is not correlated with pre-existing conditions, but the job loss actually causes it. And the longer the unemployment stretches, the worse it gets. Workers who are out for more than 6 months show the worst mental health outcomes by a significant margin. Here's the part that you might find counterintuitive. You would think that perhaps widespread layoffs would at least offer some comfort and solidarity, right? Like misery loves company. If everyone's in the same boat, maybe it feels less like a personal failure. But the research says that's not how it works. When job loss is systemic rather than individual, workers actually have fewer pathways to new opportunities. The market has contracted, the doors have closed at the same time. So you can't leverage your network when your network is also unemployed. And there's a cultural layer that makes this particularly acute in the United States. Studies show that unemployed American professionals are far more likely to blame themselves for losing their jobs than their counterparts in the study in Israel, where the tendency is to attribute job loss to systemic factors. Self-blame and unemployment is associated with lower self-esteem and worse outcomes. So we have a country where workers are detaching in record numbers, where the job market is not absorbing the people who want to leave their current roles, where mass layoffs are creating communities of simultaneous unemployment, and where the cultural default is to internalize that as personal failure. The research is also specific about older workers. People in their 50s and 60s who lose their jobs during an economic downturn show measurable increases in mortality. The loss of health insurance at an age where health is beginning to matter more is part of that, but it's not the whole story. And the psychological toll of being rendered economically invisible at that stage of life is severe. We are not having a serious public conversation about any of this. We are having a conversation about productivity metrics and stock prices, though. But somewhere in a break room in a warehouse right now, someone is doing the math on their rents and their hourly rate, and those numbers are not working out. I want to be really careful here because I have no interest in romanticizing destruction. So what happened in Ontario was not actually heroic at all. 20 people were working that night shift, and every last one of them lost their workplace and lost the jobs that they had. So Abdul Karim did not torch a boardroom. He torched the jobs of the exact people he claimed to speak for. The comment sections under articles discussing what happened really, they understood that. And so the response was not celebration of this guy. It was more like, okay, wow, that is how we all feel, but that was also incredibly stupid. But we really do need to think about why this had such mass interest. Like, why is a line about wages resonating that broadly? Why are people scrolling past a video of a burning warehouse and not thinking anything other than like, oh, how horrible? And it's not because people secretly want to burn things down. The reality is that a significant portion of the workforce feels like they have been screaming into the void for years. They have wages that don't cover rent or mortgage. They have contractors shielded by layers of corporate structure. Layoffs that are announced on earning calls while stock prices rise. And what we know from this Triangle Shirtwaist fire is that when workers cannot be heard through normal channels, the pressure will build until it finds another outlet. The factory owners did not listen to the strikers, and 16 months later, after 146 people were dead, they had to change because the pressure became untenable. Corporate America can do this the easy way, like actually deal with the conditions that are producing this widespread anger, or they can keep just not thinking about it. But the workers who can't afford their lives, who can't get food or pay their rent, they're not just going to quietly disappear. Some of them are going to find their own way to say it. And just as we saw in Ontario, that way is not good for anyone, including the workers.